The Republic of Finland may have celebrated its 100th birthday in 2017, but its military history stretches back centuries. Unfortunately, though, the vast majority of its history, along with the lessons and stories, isn't translated into the English-speaking world. Today, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Finnish military history. The military history of Finland can be divided into 4 distinct periods, with numerous sub-periods within it. But we're going to look at the main divisions. The first period being the Pre Swedish Era, the second is the Swedish Empire era, third the Grand Duchy of Finland or Russian Empire era, and the fourth being the Independent Republic of Finland or Modern Era. The Pre Swedish Era is anything before the 12th century, and mainly consists of poorly documented battles, most of which come from the Nordic sagas, Germanic and Russian chronicles, and of course the Swedish legends. Many of these talk about Finnish mercenaries in Danish or Swedish service, others talk about the war bands from Karelia or Kvenland attacking settlements in northern Sweden. The 2 most well-known accounts of prehistoric fighting in Finland comes from the saga of Olaf Haraldsson retelling the story of Olaf II of Norway's Viking raid of southern Finland, and the Battle of Herdala, in which he nearly lost his life. The other account is from the Laurentian Codex, which is probably the first of the Finnish Novgorodian Wars. Prince Vladimir Yaroslavich of Novgorod led a military campaign into Finland in 1042. The general consensus is that Finland was settled around 8,300 BCE. Due to the acidity of Finnish soil, human remains are poorly preserved, and so this makes it hard for archaeologists to gather evidence on prehistoric warfare. The first solid archaeological find of military equipment comes from the Bronze Age, with battle axes and swords, as well as hill forts. The Swedish Empire period starts in the 12th century. The early part of this period is filled with conflicts between the various Finnic tribes and the Novgorodians. Finland's position between Sweden and Russia put it on the front lines of either side's expansion efforts in the 12th century. Academics debate the legitimacy of several conflicts chronicled in the 12th to 14th centuries, especially the 3 so-called Swedish Crusades, but the remains of numerous forts and weapons shows that the period was restless nonetheless. The Finnic people seemed to be heavily divided, and their loyalties waxed and waned through the years. The Icelandic Eagles saga has the Norse and Nordic Finnic tribes fighting against the Karelians and Novgorodians, while the Prince of Novgorod, Dmitry Alexandrovich, campaigned against the Karelians in 1278. By early 14th century, the various successful campaigns and crusades against the Finns, as well as colonization of the coastal areas and the signing of the Treaty of Nutburg in 1323 between Sweden and Novgorod, Finland became part of the Swedish Empire. To help secure their power and govern the land, 3 large stone castles were built at Turku, Hämeenlinna, and Viipuri, to use their modern Finnish names. Relations between the Swedish Empire and her eastern neighbour were rocky at the best of times, and Finland was often the front line between the 2 major powers. Sometimes these conflicts consisted of the native populations, Finns, Karelians, and Sami, launching raids and skirmishes deep in the territory of the other nation. At other times, the organized forces of the empires clashed with one another at the numerous strategic places in Finland. It was during the Swedish period that many of Finland's modern military units trace their origins. For instance, the Pori Brigade traces itself to the establishment of the Pori Province Infantry Regiment. This unit was raised on the 16th of February 1626 by Gustavus Adolphus II for use during the 30 Years' War. It isn't known how many Finns served in the Royal Swedish Army during the period, but it is estimated that Finns took part in at least 38 wars of note for Sweden, whether they be during the power struggles of the Swedish royals or in wars between Sweden and other nations. The next era is the Grand Duchy or Russian period. This is as a result of the Swedish Empire losing to the Russian Empire in the short Finnish War of 1808-09. The Treaty of Hämeenlinna concluded peace on Russian terms by ceding everything east of Tornio and Muonio rivers, as well as the Åland Islands. The Grand Duchy of Finland was set up by Tsar Alexander I in order to bypass Finnish resistance to Russia. He promised to respect Finland's Lutheran faith, the Swedish-based Diet and estates, freedom of language and other minor details. While nominally autonomous, it was still subjected to the whims of the Tsar, which caused issues in the late 19th century. During this period, Finland's own military history can be broken down into three separate phases. The first beginning on the 18th of September 1812 with the establishment of 3 Jaeger Regiments. These were mainly intended for home defense in case Napoleon decided to strike at Russia through Finland. Today, the Gaiata Regiment traces its origins to the 3rd Jaeger Regiment. This was originally raised in Viipuri, but in 1817 a company of 274 men were assigned to Helsinki. This eventually grew into the 3rd Lifeguards Rifle Finnish Battalion. Most of these units, apart from what would eventually be the Guards Rifle Battalion, would be disbanded in 1830 for 2 main reasons. The first being economic, with these units not being cheap. The second being that the incoming Governor-General, Prince Alexander Menshikov, who was a Navy man, wanted Finland to focus more upon naval service than army service. 1830 saw the establishment of a 1,000-man strong naval unit. Some of these men were formed into coastal defence batteries, while others manned small sloops. The outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853 saw the start of the next stage of the Duchy's military. It was clear to Russian commanders that Finland was a possible gateway to Russia proper. Using the old Swedish allotment system, 6 battalions of light infantry were formed in July and August 1854. However, despite these units, alongside several Russian units, the British launched several successful raids along the coast, as well as capturing and destroying the fortress of Bormesund on the Åland Islands. So, as 1855 arrived, 3 more battalions were raised and additional Russian units arrived. It was this year that Helsinki was attacked by a joint Anglo-French fleet. As campaign season of 1856 approached, the number of troops in Finland swelled to around 50,000, with 71 battalions of Russian infantry, 18 units of Cossacks, and 84 batteries of artillery. This was supported by 1 Guards Rifle Battalion, 9 Finnish Rifle Battalions, and 2 naval detachments from Finland. The Anglo-French forces were planning a large 250-vessel-strong fleet that would be tasked with finally breaking the Russian forces defending the Baltic region, but the war ended in March before any fighting took place. Even with the war over, tensions were still high in the Empire and the Duchy. The 9 rifle battalions and 1 naval detachment, the other being disbanded at the war's end, stayed in service, albeit in a reduced state, until 1867 when all rifle battalions, minus the Guards Rifle Battalion, were disbanded mainly due to the vast economic plight in the country. The naval detachment stayed in service until 1880 when it was also disbanded. The final phase of the Duchy of Finland's military history started in 1881 when it was decided that Finland should have its own army, independent of the Russian army. Using a new Russian-based conscription law, 8 rifle battalions and 1 dragoon regiment was raised. The Guards Rifle Battalion was also transferred to the new Finnish army, but it occupied an interesting position due to its nature of being part of the Imperial Guard Corps. The Hamina Cadet School was controlled by the main administration of military educational institutions and would now produce officers for both the Finnish and Russian armies. Major General George Edvard Ramsay, a decorated war veteran of the Finnish Guards, was named commander of this newly raised army. When Tsar Nicholas II took to the throne in 1896, he concentrated on making his empire more Russian. This included a manifesto being published on the 15th of February 1899. In it, it strengthened the position of the Orthodox Church, reduced the powers of the estates and Diet considerably, and it also saw the abolishment of Finnish stamps. The Finnish army was to be disbanded, and the Finnish citizen was now to become subject to the same conscription laws as every other citizen in the Russian Empire. The rifle battalions and dragoon regiment were disbanded by March 1902. The cadet school was closed in 1903, and the Guards Rifle Battalion followed suit soon after in 1905. Many Finns refused their call-up, and such strong passive resistance saw the replacing of the conscription law with a defence tax in 1905. Finns still continued to volunteer for service in the Russian army, and when Russia went to war with Japan in 1905, hundreds of enthusiastic Finns signed up. Others, of a more nationalistic nature, made contact with the Japanese and received monetary and material support to stage an uprising. However, the war ended before anything substantial could take place. Despite the split ideals of the country, when the Russian Empire went to war in 1914, there was a flood of patriotism in the country in favour of the Empire. There were around 300 Finnish officers serving in the Imperial Army at the time, and by the end of 1914, 550 volunteers were in training. By the end of the First World War in 1918, around 800 Finns had fallen in service to the Empire. It was also during this turbulent time that Finland gained its independence in December 1917, as the Russian Empire descended into chaos of the Civil War. This then takes us into the final era of Finnish military history, the Independence era, which can be broken into three phases as well. The first being the Civil War and Interwar period. The Civil War saw the country torn apart by two opposing factions, the Reds, with communists and socialists, and Whites, with conservatives, liberals, and centralists. At the outbreak of the war, the Reds held the advantage with superiority in numbers, weapons, and position, but many of the returning Finnish-born Russian officers gave their allegiance to the Whites, alongside the Finnish-manned 27th Royal Prussian Jaeger Battalion. This allowed the Whites to train up a tactically superior force, and after months of bloody fighting, the Whites won. In the immediate aftermath, we see many veterans of the Civil War volunteering to fight in neighbouring areas such as Estonia, Karelia, and even Poland. The heimosodat, or kinship wars, was the name given to these loosely connected conflicts, and it wouldn't be until the Treaty of Tartu in October 1920 that Finland entered a period of peace. The interwar time wouldn't be completely without incident. Some members of the Civil Guard, a government-sanctioned militia akin to the National Guard or Territorials, would attempt a coup in 1932, which was soon put down. Finland's military saw itself caught up in the economic struggle that many small nations find themselves in, but at least three large militarization projects did take place, which saw the building of two panzerilaiva, or coastal defense ships, purchasing several new types of aircraft, and 5 submarines, as well as tanks, artillery pieces, and small arms. The peace was shattered on the morning of the 30th of November 1939, when thousands of Red Army soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, crossed the border into Finland. The David and Goliath struggle, now called talvisota, or Winter War, would last 105 days, and end in Finland signing a treaty that would see it lose 11% of its territory, its second largest city, and have a large concentration of Soviet troops stationed within its borders. A fragile and anxious peace lasted for 15 months until a joint Finnish and German assault would occur only days after the commencement of Operation Barbarossa. The Finnish army took back the areas lost to the Soviet Union during the Winter War, as well as expanding into East Karelia and attempting to cut off the Murmansk railway. In the summer of 1944, the tides turned, and the Soviets launched a major offensive that pushed the Finns back until they finally got them stalled at Tali-Ihantala. An armistice would be reached in September that allowed Finland to remain independent, but at a cost. One price to pay for this freedom would be starting another war, but with the goal of removing their former German allies. The Lapland War, as it would soon become known, saw little fighting, but would still cause thousands of casualties and devastate the economy further. The final phase is one that sees Finland turn from a battered loser of the Second World War to a major contributor to peacekeeping. At first, Finland walked a fine line between East and West, seeing itself being used as a pawn between the two major blocs, especially by the USSR. It was accepted into the UN in 1955, and the next year the first Finnish peacekeepers were deployed as part of the United Nations Emergency Force 1 in the Suez area to help maintain the armistice. Since then, Finland has taken part in over 40 UN missions, as well as participating in a handful of NATO security and support missions. Finland took the lessons that it had learned during the fighting with the Soviet Union and Germany to develop a defensive strategy that it continues to practice, albeit in a constantly modified form. This basically breaks down to the Finnish defence forces being used to prevent and frustrate a strategic attack upon vital areas using the full resources of the country. This is a brief, at least relatively speaking, look at Finland's military history. I hope that this will be the first of many presentations upon this interesting but often overlooked area of military history.